Hello, everybody. Welcome to the first podcast on H2O winning the debates for high school policy debate for the 2021 and 2022 topic. My name is Brian DeLong. I'm the director of debate at Indiana University and a senior lecturer in the School of Public and Environmental Affairs. I am excited to welcome our guest today, Dr. Jack Whittman, who is the vice president of Intera, a geoscience and engineering solutions organization. And he has a PhD in environmental science from Indiana University and has a host of experience, including as being a policy advisor to governors and tribes and various other items. So thank you for being here today.
I'm really happy to be here. This is great.
So we can jump into a list of questions. One is that I have for you is just, what is your interest in this field? And what drove you into focusing on water as a part of your career?
I've always been interested in natural sciences, and one of the things, I grew up in the Midwest in Illinois, in northern Illinois, and my girlfriend at the time, my wife today, and I both thought it was time to go west. And so we went to Utah, to Utah State University, just to change venue. And when we were there, I became a passionate natural resources scientist. And I was in school at Utah State University and went through that program of environmental sciences. And I got basically a really broad education on ecology, forestry, wildlife sciences, range science, which people don't really think about, but it's basically the grazing, the effects of grazing and managing grazing operations. And so I had this exposure to all of these different natural sciences, and I was in a wonderful place. Utah is an amazing place to be. And but after that, I got that job. After I got that degree, my bachelor's degree, I really couldn't get a job. I had no skills other than being able to work very hard to really sell. And I found my way through a variety of ways to become a water treatment plant operator in Salt Lake City, which is a civil service job. It's kind of a city job. I worked for the city of Salt Lake, and I did everything from buff the floors to paint pipes to clean the basins and measure the rainfall and watch how much water was flowing into the plant from upstream. And basically, if you watch and pay attention to what's happening in a surface watershed like that, which this was a watershed that was protected by Brigham Young when he got there and said, this is our water supply for the city. And if you pay attention, you become a bit of a hydrologist just by watching. And so I was measuring rainfall and then seeing how long it took before the increase in flows would arrive. And I also had to pay attention to the water quality because I had to treat the water. There were two treatment plant operators. And so you basically have to hustle through the whole plant to try to adjust chemical feeds to take out the extra sediments. And so all of that was just a job, but it was a great job. It got me thinking about something I'd never thought about. And at that time, I got a flyer from Utah State University saying all of the graduates of the master's program in watershed science had a job before they graduated. And this is the early 80s. This is 1981, 80, and the economy was pretty rough at that time, and I couldn't find work. So the attraction of the idea of getting out with a job in a field that was interesting and I had some exposure to was really attractive. So I went back to school and studied physics and calculus and all the things you need to do to be a scientist and get accepted into that program because the requirements were pretty high. So I went back to school and became a watershed scientist and applied myself then to some early career jobs where I was working for the Division of Oil, Gas, and Mining. And then I ended up being the associate director of the high-level nuclear waste management office in the governor's office. So I had to actually brief the governor when I was in my 20s on the federal government's plans to find a site to store nuclear waste. And all these topics were just so much larger than my imagination at the time. And it took me into places I never would have gone had I not been interested or, attentive. So it was just exposure to the field, I think, and the awesome feedback of just being able to be in a field that was exciting and had lots of cool parts to it. I was talking to governors and I was working in science, and I had to give testimony to Congress at one point when I was, again, in my 20s. I was in DC. So there was this instant gratification of relevance. It seemed important. And I was also connecting something that was really important to me. It has been important my whole career, was connecting the science to policy. And that's something that I don't think many people understand enough of. And I got an exposure of that through just my work. So it was a really great circumstance that I found myself in, to pay attention to the science and be a scientist, but actually advising policy makers and everyone from the legislature in the state, which I had to understand how legislatures were different than the federal congressional representation, and how they talk to each other, and how policy is actually formed. And so I had to learn these things early before I knew any of these matters, but understood the topics. And that made me into a person that was kind of able to do more than the science. It helped me in the rest of my career. From there, I went to work for the Yakama Indian Nation, where I did kind of the same work on nuclear waste, but in a different place. And that was excellent. I was advising a tribal government who had the same status as states, looking over nuclear waste isolation. And again, the reason that it makes sense for a hydrologist to do this, or a person that's a scientist in my field, is that risks of buried contaminants are really the only way that contaminant can move and get to the environment is through groundwater. So I had to be a hydrologist to really make sense of the arguments and to be able to make counter arguments. I had to actually work with teams of consultants that I would help bring to the state or the tribe. I would try to bring those people together with the right mix of skills to make the arguments that we needed to make about how well a site might perform as a nuclear waste repository. It was quite an elaborate effort.
So I definitely want to touch base on this question of nuclear waste and groundwater contamination, because I think that's likely an area that debaters around the country are likely going to research. But one question that I have is a kind of an impact on perspective. And so place yourself back into the Jack when you were 14, 15, and you were entering into high school, and that perspective that you may have had about water coming out of the faucet versus the one that you eventually obtain from being in the water treatment plant in that process to all of the areas that you've gone through in your life. What advice or reflection points would you have for these students as they're about to enter into this whole new world of water management and water policy issues?
I grew up in a relatively small town, a town of 12,000 people. And my home, the home that I grew up in, was on the edge of town, and my whole family hunted and fished. So we were kind of always out the door in the woods and along the river and in the fields. And so I was I was exposed to the natural environment as a kid in Illinois. And I was always interested in rivers. I think most people are. Humans have always been required almost to be near rivers in one way or another. And so a lot of that early experience of just hiking along the river and paying attention to it because it was there in front of me, or fishing, in a boat and paying attention to the water itself, or just knowing that I liked it, that I liked being outside, that I appreciated the outdoors in a way that some of my friends didn't, I guess, because I had that exposure and it helped me, I don't know, just be educated a little bit about what was going on around me. But that was also what's important about that time. I grew up this kind of 60s and early 70s. I grew up at a time when the whole world was just changing. So Earth Day I was almost in high school, or I was in high school, I've forgotten, but about that time. So the world was just figuring out that what we did with our water and pollution itself was a problem. And so there was a lot of media attention to it. I grew up working in a family that all of my male ancestors and my family are all foundry people. My brothers are foundry people. I was a foundry guy. My dad was, my grandpa, my everybody. So they ran the foundry, but the problem was they had to deal with the emerging new rules that were being made. The Clean Water Act was a thing that what got talked about over my kitchen table. And the Clean Air Act, these were like new things that the foundry had to retrofit in order to make it right. So I had to listen to the arguments and the issues that my dad would be fighting with as one of the people at the foundry. And that kind of got me to be at least again educated about what the problems are and what about the river. I never really thought about the river until that. And my dad's conversations and arguments that we had were helping me figure out there was something at stake, the values that were at stake, and the question of measurements even became a thing. How my dad was an engineer, and that helped me because eventually through my different jobs at the foundry, I ended up as the pollution control technician, which was not a high level job, but I at least got to measure things and see when things changed. And that was another really great experience. And I was a teenager at the time. So I think, having a kind of a stewardship ethic, kind of coming from a place where people really cared about the world around us, that was kind of value that I grew up with. And then being exposed to kind of the industrial consequences right there, it helped me see, that laid the groundwork for me for the rest, what followed. So that was really the way I was introduced and why I cared at the very beginning. It seemed to matter, and that's enough at the time,
So we're reaching about, if I can do my math right, about 60 some years between the environment movement, establishment of the EPA, the Clean Water Act, and now we have this topic. It's 2021, and we have high school students that are being asked whether or not the federal government should substantially increase its protections of water resources in the United States. That is the research topic that they're doing. So, here's a question. Well, how are we doing after, that total time? And now we're situated in 2021. How are our water resources currently being protected in the United States? On balance, are we doing okay? Or are there a lot of problems or new problems that we're learning about?
There are a lot of problems and there are new problems. So it's the latter. Not only is it that there are many problems that have to be identified and then understood as a second step. But we're constantly, because of the creature that we are, we're constantly creating new materials, new processes, new demands for goods, and so we're changing our manufacturing systems always with new chemistries. And we're not, so water treatment, as a simple example, water treatment was originally developed in the early part of the last century because people were getting sick because their intakes on the river were taking in water that had been spilled by the upstream community's sewer treatment plant. Or maybe they didn't even have a plant. They had just pipes going into the river, which is very common. So that all of water treatment was designed to take care of the bacterial and the pathogens that were in that water. Chlorine and taking out the particles, all of the things that were first a part of water treatment were really for a different kind of contaminant than the ones that we have right today. Today, there are all sorts of things in the water that were never a part of our waterway. So plastics, these forever chemicals that people talk about, the perfluorinated compounds, those are really difficult because they're engineered to be slippery. They're hard to catch on a piece of sand or anything. They're designed not to stick to things. So it's a very difficult world we're building for ourselves, and there aren't enough people paying attention to the changes that are happening in our ecosystems and in the waterways. And the problem isn't just that there are changes. I think change has happened. Change has been going on in the earth forever. What's different is that we're adding new ingredients that we're not keeping up with, that we don't find out about until later, when people eventually get sick. So we have the right structure in place. We have the Clean Water Act, and we have the Safe Drinking Water Act, and we have other acts to help define what our intention is and what our policy is. But what we don't have very often is the interpretive side, where someone tries to answer the question that you asked, which is, are we doing better? Or are we doing worse? Where are we doing worse? And why? And so and that's partly because we've made, and this is built into the system we live in, we've made political judgments about priorities. So first thing we decided to do with the Clean Water Act, as an example, was deal with the industrial dischargers of water, because they have a pipe that you can measure the water quality of and see whether it's changing. So the job that I had in the foundry was to try to make sure that we were meeting our requirements. And so it was kind of easy to go back and push the changes on the industries that were discharging water and the communities, but we didn't change how agriculture, they measured their impact. So, because it was too complicated, it's like instead of one foundry in one town, we have thousands of farmers across the landscape, each of which contributes something to the drain that then goes into the river. So the first thing we did was and I think this was wise, we did what we could get our hands around quickly, and the thing we could modify fairly quickly. And the second thing that we've never gotten around to is dealing with the complicated patterns of agricultural land uses that really also need to be addressed, and in some cases are being addressed by policies. But really, it's a more difficult problem just because of the character of that land use.
So we can use agriculture as an example, I think, then, in terms of protection of water resources. What would it take for the federal government to implement some sort of policy to protect waterways and the resources from runoff. Is that something that the government is currently suited to do? And how would that work between state, localities, and any other political interests that may be involved with it?
Well, some states have kind of shown that it's possible. So I think the first part of the problem is to measure, because whether you're a farmer or you live in town, or whether you work in a factory or you work for a food processing facility, you still think that the way to attack a problem is to first understand the problem. So what has to be done, I think, to begin is to really understand how agriculture affects the waterways and water quality, or even water availability in some cases, how it affects the streams that we're living around in our waterways and aquifers. So it's kind of both aquifers and the flowing streams. And so there's a lot that has to be done to improve how we manage data and how we measure change, how it occurs. And we have to, I think, become a little bit more scientific and structured in the way that we implement policies, so that we could actually try things out in experimental way in some townships maybe, or counties, and then compare and contrast that with other similar landscape counties that use different approaches. I think that it's always better if people can want to do the thing than be told to do the thing, whatever that is. So we have to, I think, even think about paying something for not polluting. One of the problems in this world that we live in is that we don't pay for water. Water is assumed to be free and infinite quantity, and it should be, we think, clean. But really, it's not any of those things. We have to pay for it to be transported. We have to pay for it to be treated. But we really treat it like it's a free commodity. So when you pay your water bill, you're not paying for the cost of the water, usually. You're paying for the cost of treating the water, pumping the water. The person that is there, like I was at the water treatment plant, you're paying that salary. You're not paying for the water. And in Europe, that's not the case. In Germany and the Netherlands, you pay per cubic meter of water to use it. And then what's so great about it is you get paid equally the same number of dollars or euros if you put that water back in the aquifer. So if you pump the water out, it costs X euros. And if you put the water back, you get that many euros, but it has to be equal quality. So we have to think, I think, more about what we understand, which is money and commerce, and use some of those instruments to create incentives for the kind of behaviors that we can probably will be able to let us continue as a civilization further into the future. So I'm really hopeful that we learn how to create the incentives without some of the more complicated regulatory schemes that have been proposed, I think.
I don't know if you can provide some examples of that. So I think without doing prior research on a topic like this, an assumption could be made that maybe the federal government could approach protections almost like a sledgehammer, but missing the scalpel that may be required. So you're referencing a lot of the test case locality solutions to some problems. And so that, I think, is a question in a lot of people's minds entering into this topic is, they can likely say, we see agricultural runoff, we see runoff from cities, and it has a lot of complexity in legal landscapes and federalism, and you name it, and various interests that exist, within it. if I just propose a solution like you mentioned, I say the federal government should establish a scheme that incentivizes usage of water, including a payment scheme and a rebate system, as long as the water is of quality. I mean, that sounds like a very complex scheme that would, I don't envision that happening during the Biden administration or anytime soon. But it's these debaters have the ability to think about it. Are there risks that a good faith effort like that could backfire, become potentially counterproductive because of the backlash, political or otherwise?
Yes, I think there are risks of that outcome. I mean, the idea, as you describe it, is to create an economy that doesn't exist at all right now. There's no, except, by the way, in the West. In the West, water, unlike in the East, has a value just like a mineral. So that when you buy land, you can buy the land and not have any water rights. So in the West, they have experience with the idea of paying for the right to use water. That's kind of built into the Western water law world. So the eastern side of the country, it's riparian water law, which simply means that if you can access the water from your property, it's yours. And in Indiana, we have the most libertarian approach to that. That is to say, if you need to use the whole flow of the West Fork of the White River, and you need to do that because you're making cars or something, and you need to use it for cooling water and processed water, and you have to take the entire river, the White River, all into your plant, it's 100% okay in Indiana to dewater the river itself, because in Indiana, riparian water law, without any planning or anything, allows for use of the water. There aren't any limits on how much you can take here in our state, in the eastern US. In other states, there are other things that are in play, but our state doesn't have any restrictions. The reason that happens to work is we're a very wet state, but there are limits even in our state where the flows are low, and it's just because of the users of the water along the way, whether it's power plants, whether it's water for utilities, whether it's for manufacturing or agriculture. They all use water. So the question of how to address the problem of price, or whether it makes sense to go forward with this, is really I think you have to ask another question, and that is, by suggesting that we don't go down that path because it is complicated, we're really choosing to stay with what we have. And so there are problems with what we have that we have to address. And one of the problems is related to the zero price effect, which is to say that there's this real thing, you can look it up, zero price effect. And what that theory says in economics is that if anything is free, it is almost always abused, wasted, and not cared for in general. So that even applies to things that you can pick up for free at a garage sale. Almost everything that's free in a garage sale is thrown away, regardless of its actual value or value to someone else. So the price, we have signals, it's symbolic value. If it were $1 a million gallons, that would change behavior because it's $1, not because it's too much or anything. So as much as I understand the idea that it could go wrong, or it could be difficult, or it would be hard to set up and create these markets, well, they actually exist in the Western United States. It must not be that tricky. Kansas can do it, but Missouri doesn't have to. So there's a line through the United States. On one side, they've understood how to deal with water as a property right. And on the other side, we haven't figured out how to at least pay for the use of the water that we have so much of. But I think in order to manage the problems of the future, the problems of changing populations, moving from one place to another, and kind of keeping up with the climate change that may occur along the way, we have to build in some kind of resilience with how we deal with water supply. And I think that the economic incentives and drivers are part of the answer.
So you mentioned kind of a regional management of water. I came from Wyoming, and so I'm aware of the conversations of river usage and how I think the common discourse around it is oh, Vegas and California and Arizona are taking all of our water, right? Are there issues with the contemporary model of that on the West side in terms of how they set the limit of the pricing, and how do they deal with those type of problems or issues?
Well, it's funny that you mentioned Wyoming too, because we worked on our company helped do the Laramie, Wyoming's aquifer protection plan for the aquifer that they use for a fraction of their water. And really, the problems in the West are very different. Water supply, both contamination and water supply problems are very different in the West because of the different kinds of economies that exist in the West and in the Eastern US. And I don't think people appreciate how different the world is on either side of the country. Unless you've lived in the West and then in the East, you really don't know how many fewer but larger power plants there are in the West. There are just fewer. And it's because there are fewer people in general. It's less dense population, et cetera. And yes, I think Las Vegas or whatever is a good symbol of a problem, but I don't think it's as simple as saying it is the problem. Las Vegas is the reason it's useful to bring up and talk about is because it reflects something from the past that's still there, a belief that we had as much as we needed and we don't have to worry about it. And they've been over the past 20 years, they've been working to undo that understanding and change our thinking about water in Las Vegas. So they've had fantastic and I think really brilliant leadership there to try to turn it around and make this city be a much more water conscious and planned growth community from what they had been before, which was just a boom town centered around gambling. So now they're still centered around gambling and entertainment, but at least their water supply isn't so precarious and balanced on a pin like it was. So this contrast between the East and the West is again very informative to me as a person that has to work across the country and the world. And I see lessons in the two approaches. Riparian water law in the East that I mentioned before really only functions as a method for providing water to those that need it if it is a part of planning, so that there are multiple stakeholders are at the table, that they all understand this is the limit on the resource, that we can't take more because that's all there is. There's a number that can't be exceeded. It's just the whole flow of the river. You can learn that number and say, okay, we can't expect more than that. And so in the East, what's required isn't necessarily the whole economic change. It's more like we have to begin talking to each other about water in the East. In many places, and Indiana is one of them, it's a new conversation. It just hasn't happened. So our company and some of the things that I've been involved in have been to try to generate the information and also be comfortable in the room to start the conversation, to facilitate conversation about it. It's not my role to say what you should want or, as a stakeholder, but it is my role to say that can't be achieved or it can be achieved, to help people to guide them through the difference between their imagined desires and what the physical system can provide.
So from that perspective, in terms of generating the quality data and then trying to bring stakeholders together, do you place your faith, and maybe you can clarify this if I'm wrong, within almost a state compact type system, or does it require at least a significant federal role to at least establish baselines like a floor to that type of cooperation? Is it possible that the Western states through a compact can fix problems, or even on the East side, or do you need some type of top-down control mechanism to bring these people together?
Well, I can think of examples of both. So it's easy to argue on either side, but the federal government, if the federal government acts, it kind of gives license to the states to first pay attention to the topic, whatever that is. And so the Great Lakes Compact is such a thing. So the Great Lakes Compact was I think federally authorized, but the states were the players. So it was this interesting mix of federal state kind of cooperation, but it's an international compact. So all of the provinces in Canada that touch the Great Lakes or that drain into the Great Lakes, as well as all of the states that drain into the Great Lakes, all were a part of this international compact. And so you can, there are these examples where the federal government can lead the way. And I think the Clean Water Act is such a case, where the Clean Water Act was, it's a broad strokes narrative that says this is what we're trying to do. We need to clean up our waterways, so we're going to start measuring these things and regulating these things. Each state then takes that guidance or that statute and they implement it that fits their state. So the way that Iowa does it and the way that New Jersey does it are understandably different. They have different reasons different things to regulate. So there aren't that many big chemical plants in Iowa, but there are a lot in New Jersey. So the way that they address the problems that they have in their state are adapted to their state, their economy, their politics, which again, I don't think of politics in the current meaning of the word. I think of it as more the reflection of the public voices that are out in the community. So I'm using it in a positive way that way. So I think that it's always better if the federal government is in coordination with the states that then implement federal law. And again, it's up to the states to manage their problems for their people. So it's kind of it cascades into the right direction, I think.
And so now I want to tie back to the indigenous lands, the tribal land issue, and whether or not you can touch on the examples, whether or not it's inclusive of radioactive waste and mining and things like that. Is that jurisdiction maybe distinct from the discussions that we've just been having about states and cooperation?
It is unique in that, so if you're a non-
Does it provide unique issues?
Native American, and you work for a tribe, the first thing that is required of you is to read the treaty that formed the tribe. At least that was my experience. And so I had to get familiar with and read the treaty and know more about it because basically that's a founding document of the tribal government. And unlike the states, the tribe was granted certain rights that included the natural system. So they were granted rights, for instance, to fish in all of their traditional fishing locations from the point when they signed the agreement for forever forward, for all the future. And so, of course, that doesn't work if the river itself becomes contaminated, or they dam the river up and the falls where they did the fishing are no longer available for fishing. So the tribal arguments are completely different, really, in many ways. But on the water rights side, so if you just talk about the water rights, they have original water rights that they tie to their fishing ecosystem. So they were granted rights to fish, and that implies that there has to be a river there to fish in, so they can move from there to a flow, a number, of value. And that implies management of some kind upstream. So they had to do a completely different it was a completely different conversation, and they didn't have as much in terms of institutional infrastructure. So I had to help.
Just to clarify, is this in the northwest of the United States? Is that what you're referencing, or which population?
Yes, okay. And I think a lot of what I'm saying is specific to the northwestern tribal arrangements that were made, because they're very different in different parts of the country. This was the treaty that formed the nation that I worked for was signed in 1856, and that was just before the Civil War. And after the Civil War, things got pretty bad, and they basically didn't reach happy agreements. But this created a very large reservation, and it had from the top of Mount Adams all the way to the Columbia River is included in the reservation. But they had water management problems on the reservation, and they had only federal agencies rather than their own agencies being the ones that were actually implementing the laws and rules to try to protect their waterways. So they were protected instead of by their state government or their tribal government in this case. They were protected by the Federal Bureau of Reclamation or the Bureau of Indian Affairs, etc. So the tribal government had to do other things, political and administrative, both, to try to create a tribal vision for their water and rules. They didn't have of their own tribal rules, so they had to come up with new methods. It was kind of like the whole thing was started a couple decades later on tribal land. What happened with the states in the 70s didn't happen until the 80s in many tribal nations. So it's very different. Tribal government is very different. How it functions, the way that they are interacting with the state government is very different than counties, let's say, even though they might be thought of in dimensions of a county. The economic power that tribal people have is not as great as people outside of the tribal land. So there are all sorts of disadvantages in terms of their position to protect their own environment. Part of my job, in addition to the nuclear waste piece of work that I started on, I ended up helping with develop a water quality protection program, basically the Clean Water Act for the reservation. And I helped get grants from the EPA, who really were interested in trying to help tribal governments, but they needed an advocate like myself to try to pull the money into the tribe and populate a department that would make measurements and do the work. But we I think take for granted the administrative machine of the state that we have, that we think it's like normal to have a state government that comes up with rules and regulations. That's actually really complicated stuff. That's as complicated as anything that we've talked about, is how you come up with a rule. And it takes, just like the rest of our government, it takes a bunch of people to come together and discuss what should we do about runoff from mint farms. In their case, where they were dealing with mint farms, were a real problem, and hops was a real issue. And because of the soils that they grow on, they got a lot of runoff from those, and they had a lot of nitrates because they don't pay, the crops don't grow any worse with high nitrate soils or high nitrogen soils. So there were a lot of things that you kind of take for granted until you're stuck in a place and you realize, oh, there isn't a rule. What do we do? Well, you kind of need to get people together to agree on plan. And I had to work with the government that was there and to make that happen. It was a great education, actually. But it also points to what I think is the critical link between the science of water and water resources and the policies that are actually the only way the understanding matters. So understanding water is fun. It's like a puzzle, and it's joyful in terms of just as an exercise in analysis and thinking. It's cool, but the cool part becomes important if you can apply it to a real community who's trying to improve their condition. So the reason that I am interested in that part of my work is that it's where meaning is found in my work. The other part is fun, and I love it, and I can do it, and that's great. But I think that if we're going to affect change in the world, we have to think in those terms as well. We have to think about, how do I find a way to improve the way that the people who are coming up with these rules, how they understand the problem. And so I've made that that's my real enterprise that I am engaged in. I'm here to do that.
So we have a lot of debate coaches and debaters that do not have the science background that I think that you're referencing. I don't know if you can provide some suggestions, whether curriculum, items to read, or how to reflect on these issues to make sure that the science is being translated accurately, and that maybe these hosts of debaters around the country can become the advocates for change and become a part of the bureaucracies and things like that to improve the world around them.
Well, I think that the realization I had to come to myself when I was young and I was trying to go into this direction was I thought I was going to be able to go through college, which I actually was able to almost pull off, but go through college without taking calculus. I thought that was like a goal of mine because, I didn't understand it. I didn't get it.
Yeah.
It was too complicated for what I thought I could do somehow. I think a lot of people, maybe more than half of the people that go through high school think that they think I can't, that's really complicated. I couldn't do that. But here's what I convinced myself of, and I am. This is probably important to make a note of. I finished in the top third of my high school graduating class of 400 people, 90% of whom didn't go to college. Okay, so I'm telling you, I was not a stellar student in high school. I was a B- B student at best, in that range. So I didn't know, I never applied myself to school then. I got interested in it when I got to college. But what I kind of made myself understand when it got to the point where I needed to take this step was that all of us can do calculus. Every single person on the planet could do calculus. It's not hard. And it took me a long time to convince myself that if I can read a book, I can do calculus. It's a human thing that we have in our brains, whether or not we choose to exercise it. I mean, it's almost like we can all, if we wanted to, do 50 sit-ups and 30 push-ups, and that's just true. We could probably, when we're younger, we can all do that. Well, calculus is the same. And I convinced myself of this before I could do it. I was frightened and nervous about it because I hadn't the exposure. I wasn't a scientist. I didn't take physics beforehand, none of that. But if I hadn't convinced myself of that and had a good teacher at the same time, I think I would have missed this whole career. I went down that path. It was not my strong suit. And yet, because I am this person that cares about the rest of the story, I became more effective as a scientist because of the rest of myself. I think more people have to think that way, to say, that's not my first natural thing, is to do a free body diagram and figure out the physics of this. But that's accessible. It's all we have to do is go look. And so statistics, chemistry, and mathematics, at least the starting part, that Newton figured out. I mean, you should at least know the Newtonian stuff. That is central to science. You need to understand those things so that you can kind of, in your head, always be thinking and critiquing other people's ideas. Does that add up? I mean, is it likely that that's the case? I ask myself that all the time. It has made me into a very effective skeptic, which I think is another word for a scientist. So,
So if you were to provide advice for somebody just dipping their toe in the water of the topic, where should they begin researching issues like this? Do you have suggested resources? So you've mentioned the work that you've done and the
sure.
The research that you've done and advocated for. I mean, there's lots of organizations out there that push stuff out, and the internet can say anything that you want it to say. And so how do they find good research? How do they find good information?
The USGS, the U.S. Geological Survey, is the only federal agency that is focused on water. And we don't have any water supply institution, but they at least are the measurers of water, of stream flows, and have been for over 100 years. So their reports are technically excellent. They're almost all written by excellent scientists. And so that is a real good place to go to find out what are the conditions in a place. That's a part of a story. That's a way to infer of what's happening around the rest of the country. But if you want a big picture version of this question that we're talking about, which is about water, what needs to be protected and how much and what's the future, The Big Thirst is the definite book that you want to read. It is written by Charles Fishman. No, not Charles. What's his name? Anyway, The Big Thirst. You can Google it and get that. I've met the author. I think the world of it. And basically, that book is about one really important thing, and that is
Charles Fishman is the name.
Charles, okay, good. Glad I got part of it right. But it's a great book because it's fun to read first, and second, it points out something that people mostly don't think about, and that is that it is never going to be less important that we understand water. Never. So from now into all the future, this is the least we're going to ever be able to think about water right now. So tomorrow, the world needs us to think a little bit harder about it than it did today, because the changes that are happening in the oceans, in our states, and the way we discharge to waterways, the way we use land that contaminates aquifers or doesn't, how we plan, how we talk to each other and include each other in conversations that might have an impact on other people in the landscape, that's never going to be less important. So all of The Big Thirst is about the fact that water is about to change. water, the whole topic is going to change very soon. So I think if you just have a Google search, which I always run, which is a search on water supply problems, and I look globally, almost daily at what's happening around the world. And I've been doing that for about a decade, and I think that it's stunning. It's really stunning. And I think until more people are paying attention to what's happening, what we are doing as we live in this world, I don't think that anyone really appreciates how absolutely serious this topic is. As much as, I have fun doing it, this is my life, and it's a great world of business, and I like the people I work with and all of that. The fact of the matter is, this is as serious as anything is in our collective domains. Water supplies are the only ways that we can stay where we are. We need water to be clean. We need the future to be secure for us to be even half-assed stewards of the resource. We have to be confident that our children and their children and their children and all future children have enough water. So the question of whether to use aquifers or whether to use the river, that's consequential. Whether to use a chemical that we don't know the effect of, or whether to use something that we do know how to treat with and worry and what will break it down, those are big decisions. They're not little decisions that have short-term consequences and yield differences or whatever they might be. We have to think in these other terms in order to make good choices for our future.
Yeah. So I want to ask you kind of a technical question. The topic is written not by experts, but with some information in terms of research, but we don't always get it right. And one question that has been raised several times is whether or not these terms mean anything. And in particular, do you believe that this may be a term of art, or if it is defined somewhere as controlling in some way about what it is and what it isn't? Water resources. So people are worried that water resources is literally anything that is related to water, whether transportation or anything else. And so from your work in the field, is that term defined somewhere as being inclusive or exclusive of something?
It's a good question because because it has to be addressed, I guess, early in thinking about this. But the way I define it is, so there's like in the field of hydrology, I draw the line at the Earth's surface, right? But I had to take meteorology and I had to take climate, other courses that related to atmospheric water. But where I begin, my expertise begins when the water hits the Earth, right? So there is a difference. It's not atmospheric water, and it's not the water in the clouds and that kind of thing, which can affect the other, but it's not that. So water resources, as I define it, are the resources that we can actually alter or change or improve or damage, I suppose. And so that would include, groundwater and surface water. Those are the two baskets. And then there's marine environments, which are kind of a different water. And then there's also all of the frozen water that's shrinking as a total on Earth, but that's another block, let's say, in a diagram. So groundwater, even though it's a small fraction of the total water that's on the Earth, it's more than 90% of the available water for use is groundwater. It's a large fraction. I'm not sure about the number. It's a huge fraction of the total.
And that's inclusive of ice.
Yeah, inclusive
yeah.
of,
Okay.
They're not, because this is important. Ice is not available because it's ice. Usually you can't go to Greenland, and you may be able to now, but I mean, in general, the idea of Greenland is a big block of ice on an island in the North Atlantic. But the idea is it's not accessible. It's there and it's water, but it's not accessible. That you can't, freshwater part of it isn't there. So you can't really use it. It's just unavailable. Ocean water is too salty generally to use, although you can put desal on it. It costs a few times more than fresh water to deliver safely. And so you're left with the two standard places where we go for the water resources, for irrigation, for power, for manufacturing, for agriculture, all the things that we use, and drinking water. It's either out of a river, a reservoir, or an aquifer. Those are the options you have. So I think of water resources as those few that we're left with. The ones that are true across the country, they all have rivers, they all have aquifers, and they all have some reservoirs of different sizes. So I would put the boundaries around that bundle. And I think you can include desal because it is important in some cases. Texas is actually pumping very salty water out of their deep brine formations and treating it for use. And for drinking water use, they're mixing it to make it taste better. And they're doing desal in both the Atlantic and Pacific side of our country. Almost all of the resorts in Mexico that are along that the North Americans flock to Mexico, to Cabo and all these other places, those are all desal plants that are right on the ocean. But I think that water resources, as I think of them, are freshwater resources. And that's how I define it for my own sense of, at least perspective. Then I can think about, okay, what are the options? What are the consequences in that case? The marine world is valid, because it's part of our world. It's part of the earth, but it's like a different problem. It's international law, etc. So it's a different concern, I think.
So I did want to follow up on one thing that you mentioned earlier about the Salt Lake Compact being international. And I guess the question is, when we think of water, and the topic again says in the United States, can many of these actions be primarily focused inward on U.S. jurisdictions, or will there be requirements for collaboration across boundaries? And I assume the international partners are Mexico and or Canada.
Yeah, you misspoke. I think you said Salt Lake. You meant Great Lake just now.
Yes. Yeah. Sorry, Great Lakes.
That's okay. I just wanted to correct it for
yes.
the recording, if nothing else. And the fact is that the international partners are built in to both the responsibility of management, because they're both, let's look at the Great Lakes, and the problem there is that both countries of Canada and the United States feed their water into the Great Lakes. So managing the Great Lakes is not up to one country. So we can do anything we want on our shore, but if they do something different on their shore, the whole thing breaks. You're not really managing the resource as a system. It requires international agreements that are really, again, kind of new in our country anyway. The Mexico side is a different problem because it really is, the American side is the user of the river before it goes to Mexico. And then once it's in Mexico, they get what's left over. And usually that has been really salty return flows from irrigation canals that are barely there because everyone's using up their water rights along the way. So the agreement with Mexico is we promise to deliver water that's this fresh with total dissolved solids or saltiness somehow measured and in this quantity. It's a promise we made to them. And we have been delinquent on that over decades. So we're just now figuring out how to deliver them the water that we promised them, long ago that we would be delivering. And that itself is a problem inside the United States, where the Colorado River is flowing through the states that are fighting with each other about who should even get it. So the Western US is locked up in that problem, and Mexico gets whatever the outcome is of that argument. In Canada, because both sides are literally draining into the Great Lakes, to manage the Great Lakes, you have to be somehow managing both sides of the ponds. And there, if you wanted to read a very interesting story, a very excellent and amazing story, there is a great book called The Death and Life of the Great Lakes. And I recommend it highly. It's really more about the fisheries, but it's stunning. And it's about how the Great Lakes once were and how they have become what they are today, and how many changes have happened in their fisheries and in their whole, how the system worked before and how it works now. Fantastic journalism. It's written by a guy that used to be at the Milwaukee Sentinel, I think, and it's a great story.
So do you think, and again, so I'm going to go back to the definition side of things. Topic says substantial increase in protection of water resources. Do you think inclusive of that would be, let's say, biodiversity policies, either fishing regulations or integration of or defense from foreign species, the Asian carp integrating itself into the Great Lakes, for example, and the tiger mussels and things like that? Or would you place it more within maybe the human factor that includes the pollutants that you were referencing before? Tough question, I know.
Yeah, because the answer is, of course, it's not quite either. The fact is that, one of the reasons I mentioned that book about the death and life of the Great Lakes, but what it talks about is how different invasive species have kind of occupied the Great Lakes, and why that happened, and who was in charge, or was anyone in charge, and what did we do about it, or what didn't we do. And this is all from the 40s and 50s and 20s and times way before now, a century ago, up till the most recent. But invasive species are, I think, a different character of a problem than all of the other things that you mentioned, because they are almost impossible to control completely, but they can be controlled. I mean, it's because it's about creatures. We could probably keep them, slow down their expansion from where they are to where they might be. So there is definitely, though, a kind of ecosystem function that we have to understand and appreciate, that's built into the waterway and built into the aquifer too, by the way. The aquifers treat water. That's why you can drill a hole in your backyard and drink it. It's kind of unusual when you think about it. And you can do that in this part of the state, or you can go up north and drill through a bunch of sand, and it's the same. You can pretty much drink the water. It's going to be clean enough. But
limestone filtration systems, right? Is that what?
Right. There's something. Yeah. I mean, exactly. Here we drink it out of the lake. I don't know if you knew that, but
yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure you do, of course. But I was just thinking about if water, the contamination problem that we face is, to me, a problem that it takes more courage, I think, political courage, to address the problems that relate to contaminants, because of the many industries that affect what ends up in our water. So it used to be pretty simple. you just had to talk to the foundry in my town and a couple other places, and you kind of had most of that problem was sorted out. You got the pipes fixed and a treatment plant that they put in, and they took that stuff out of the water and pretty much discharged better water. So there was improvement right away when the Clean Water Act began. The same with the Clean Air Act. It's kind of, I'm just using that as another example. When it started, they hit the easy to hit issues or pollutants and improved things pretty dramatically. But today, we create pollutants in a different way. It's again, with plastics, it's really coming from our clothes dryers and our washing machines. It's like, wait a minute, that's different. And plastics, unlike other contaminants, can actually weave their way into the cells and in the organs of the animals that consume it, so that we're creating consequences we really don't know what they are. So no one has done enough work to see what the risks are, and yet I think I'm wearing some plastic now on my clothes, and I mean, you can't help it. I have a stretchy shirt on or something, and it's has some plastic component. So we have to become better at protecting the resources, because the resources, especially groundwater, doesn't turn over very fast. It's something we haven't talked about, but rivers refresh themselves. They literally, more water replaces the water that's in front of you in a river. That's what a river is. But groundwater moves about 1 step per day at the most. That's as fast as it can move. And so 1 step in a day for sort of fast moving groundwater or reasonably moving groundwater, it can take hundreds of years to get to the river, or 100 years easily, even here in our state. So the problems that we are going to leave behind for generations are not going to be easy to fix for our descendants, for my grandchildren. My grandchildren are going to inherit whatever it is that our society thought was okay to put on the ground, whether that's a new agricultural chemical, whether it's something from our clothing, whether it's something that's needed to make iPhones. We end up with that is in our water. We have to be careful, because groundwater, especially old groundwater, is almost impossible to replace. It's a reservoir of, so I want to give a really good example of this, and that is outside of Chicago, the suburban belt that is a big C shape around the city of Chicago. All of those communities used to use all groundwater from a single aquifer about 1,600 feet below the ground. It's a sandstone that everyone was producing from. That water was recharged when there was over 1 mile of ice on top of the land. When it was completely inundated with glaciers, and that all of that different condition pushed the water into those aquifers.
Oh wow!
That water isn't coming back. Okay, zero. That's all fossil water. And yet, the city of Chicago, the suburbs of Chicago, depended on it for all that time. And now the city of Chicago is selling basically Lake Michigan water to get those communities off their drinking. The reason they're getting off their drinking water isn't because it's so old and important, it's because they are usually pumping contaminants or some other thing, their gas stations spilled or whatnot. So we really need to think about water differently than we do in order to address this topic. And how do we protect it? Increasing the protection is one thing, but what we protect and how we prioritize what we protect is not the same in every part of the country. So in Indiana, it's the shallow alluvial and outwash aquifers that surround the streams. That's our resource that where long residence times, you can't clean it up if it spills, etc. It really long-lasting issues. In other parts of the country, it's another thing. It's a different problem. There's not enough water in Utah, for instance. So it really varies from place to place.
Does it seem like regulations are, or at least the current framework, whether state or federal based, maybe doing okay with the larger streams, rivers, but you're mentioning a lot about the groundwater and maybe some of the smaller ditches and runoff from those types of areas. Is that the problem, or we're just not tackling the right issues, such as the persistent chemicals, or, as you were mentioning, household production of plastics that then go down to the treatment plant, and the treatment plants apparently don't catch them, or maybe that's presenting a new problem to them as well?
For the most part, surface water treatment plants are good at they can manage plastics pretty well that are standard plastics because of they measure them. So they measure at a water treatment plant, they actually look for plastics now. They're not required to, however, so that's to me kind of amazing. But in groundwater, you don't find plastics as much as you do in surface water. I think that the problems that we face in terms of water supply in that way are really that we are not collecting the data that we need to answer the question that you asked, actually. So you just asked, are the small streams the problem, or the large streams the problem? And one of the other arguments that's inside of the big thirst is we don't collect hardly any data anywhere on any stream. So the number of monitoring wells in our state fell from over 200 to less than 100 during the 1990s. And the only reason was because it cost a little bit of money to monitor water levels in each of these wells. And so it was understood by our state that it was probably not necessary because we've been measuring those wells for a long time. So what more can we get out of that? Is there any more information, And the fact is we don't hardly know what density of data we need to answer questions about those supplies themselves. So one of my current initiatives in my career is to try to instrument areas at a density that can illuminate the problems. So, right now, if you only knew the elevation so currently there are about one or less than one monitoring well in every county. So if I told you I know the elevation in that county, and I knew it because I stood on a place and found out the elevation at that location in a county, and then I said, this is a map of the state now, so you can see the state, and it's got there's a bump here, I don't know what it is, and there's a thing over there, and it's flat over there, but I don't know. You'd be sampling at such a dispersed scale that you might not even find the Grand Canyon. I mean, that's the problem that we have. It's kind of called the Grand. There is a term of art. Would you even see the Grand Canyon if you just dropped points around it? You might not see it. It's like, well, that's maybe a hole. I don't even know.
Oh,
so
wow.
We're there. We're there. We're not better than that. We're there. We've added a few more monitoring locations in our state, but I want to put 50, 60, 70 in a county, so that we can see and ask different questions than we've ever been able to ask and answer.
That's both enlightening and frightening all at the same time.
Yeah, story of my funny career. I mean, because when I look at the world, I see what you just said. I'm actually concerned that not enough people see what I'm seeing. The problems are large. The money is small.
Are there ways to integrate, I think the concept is citizen scientists, to try to increase observations and measurements in a cheaper way? Or does it require the deeper technology that you're referencing?
Some of it is citizen science-able. You could take trained citizens who can measure, and they could, just like me, before I studied hydrology, I kind of was a hydrologist. I knew what to expect after it rained, and I knew what was strange and what was not strange, and why it was cloudier and not cloudy, at a certain point when I was paying attention to that one stream that I worked on. But the problem is that citizen science is usually dismissed when making policy. My role today is as an expert. I have, the reason I've worked so hard to get inside of the legislature in Indiana is to help inform people and to be a reliable answer to the question that people have. And I work with the governor, I work with the Republican Senate, I work with the Democrats, I work with no matter what. I don't care about the political positions of anyone. I'm really just trying to help them see the problem that is there, or that we need to look at to understand. So citizen science is good for the individuals, the people that are doing it, just like it was good for me. It helped me see the world more clearly. It helped me understand my local stream, my local condition. But to change the world in the way that I want to change the world, I have to talk to a different set of audiences, to different people who are trying to make decisions, and most all of them want good things to happen. They're not trying to do anything bad. They just are trying to say, what are the trade-offs here? Is this a big deal, or is it not? So I'm very optimistic, but that's how I live my whole life. So I'm bent that way. That's how I was born, I think.